Hi, everyone. These slides contain some information that'll hopefully help you manage your data. So your data are going to be at the heart of your research project, as they are for scientific research more generally. Your research results will be based on your data. You may be working with a small data set from a small lab experiment or from a large data set that was collected by someone else for another purpose. Even if you're using existing data, you're likely to change it to be able to answer your research questions. You might reorganize the data. You may create new variables. You may change the way some of the variables are coded. So in the process, you'll be creating a new data set. And these data that you create are a very important component of the contribution that you're making to knowledge. They are a public resource that contributes to knowledge beyond your individual research project, because the data can be used to answer other research questions through other research projects. So when you think about managing your data, you should think about the fact that you're managing an important public resource for a broader purpose than just your individual project. In the poetic words of Professor Hugh Ducklow, data need to be curated. You're selecting, organizing, and looking after a very important collection, like a fine art collection. So these slides will outline some good practices for managing and curating your data. And just to emphasize the point that the data can be used to contribute to knowledge more broadly, this is a quote from one of the economists who got the Nobel Prize last year. I've had thousands of downloads of my published data. I am impressed that it's been so useful to others. When you're thinking about how to manage your data, there are a couple of things that you should be thinking about. For yourself, for your own project, your research results will only be as good as your data is. So you will need to make sure that your data is correct, that as you process the data, it's easy to introduce errors. So you'll have to make sure that you keep it correct, that you're not introducing errors, and that you're analyzing it correctly. That's a very detail-oriented process. Basically, what you get out of it at the end of the day will be valid, correct, only if each step along the way is correct. You'll have to pay attention to a lot of details along the way. Nobody ever gets it right the first time. The only way that you get it right is by going back and checking each step again and again and again. And the only way that you can go back and check your data cleaning, your data processing, your data analysis is if you have a record of it, if it is documented, so you can go back and actually verify that each step was done correctly. So the first thing that you should be thinking about is, what do I need to have a record of to make sure that I can go back and check each one of my steps from when I first entered my first piece of data or opened my first data file that I got from somewhere up to the very last analytical step. The second thing you may want to be thinking about is, what would another researcher need to know in order to be able to use this data or to reproduce my study for that matter. So you need to manage data to store it safely, ensure that you and others can understand it, use it, and verify it now and in the future, and provide easy access to other researchers. And a data management plan records the information that you need for each one of those objectives. So the first thing that applies to absolutely all of you is you need to store your data safely. You don't want to be a couple of months into your research project and lose your data. So you need to back it up. And so when I say data, I mean all the files associated with your project, your data, your code files, your documentation, your writing. Anytime you change anything in those files, back them up at the end of the day and keep the files in at least 2 different places. So for example, on your laptop, on an external hard drive that you may be backing them up to, you can email them to yourself. Don't keep them on a flash drive. They're too easy to lose. When you're storing your final files at the end of the project, consider keeping them in an open, stable format that other people can access easily, like ASCII texts so on, but always keep your original files in the format that you worked with them in as well. For documenting and organizing your data, some things that you may want to consider doing during your project is recording information about your project and data that another researcher would need to reproduce the study. What would they need to know? You want to have a document, whether it's a file on the computer or a paper notebook, that describes your study objectives, design, if there's a geographical location associated with it or a time frame that applies to the data, if that's relevant. The study objectives and the design will evolve over the course of your project. You don't want them to just be in your head. You don't want to keeping track in your head of where you're at in that evolution process. It's really important to have them written down and be revising the written version as you change it and kind of rethink it and check it. Metadata is information about your data that you need to find it, use it, cite it. I will go over what that may include on the next slide. And it's really important to document your analytical methods, but again, so that you can check them repeatedly and so that others may be able to use them for other research purposes. So if you're using code to process and analyze your data, you may want to include lines of text in your code that explain what each piece of code does. If you're anything like me, I shock myself at how quickly I forget what each piece of code was supposed to be doing. If you're not using code, find another way to document how you processed and analyzed the data, that's sort of each step of it. You may want to use a logbook to track your progress through your research project, through your research plan, your progress through data collection if you're doing that, data entry analysis. The metadata that I was referring to, data about your project and data that you may want to make sure to document. Of course, when you document your objectives and research design, you should have, that should include the project title. Creator would be you, but if you're getting the data from somewhere else, if you're using existing data, you want to document where that data comes from, dates of the project, subject matter, the funding and intellectual, funding and intellectual property rights may be less relevant for you. Your project will consist of many files, most likely, your whatever documentation of the project you have, your data files, any code, and then your writing, your actual proposal, and then your thesis. In the data, you want to include data files that contain any accompanying data that may be informative, that maybe you're not using directly for your project, but may be informative about it, important for the context. It may be important for others, may end up being important for you, may be important for others. For example, if you're sampling water quality, maybe you have data on the weather on the days on which the water quality was sampled. That may be important information. Keep a record of file names and formats associated with your project, where they're located, and the software that's needed to access them. It's useful to have a consistent file naming scheme, which should include your project name. So if your project is about water access, include the words water access in your file names. It may be useful to easily identify all the files that are associated with the project. It's easier to work with file names when you know when they tell you what's in the file. For example, baseline for your baseline data, area A if you have multiple study areas, and always associate a date or a version number with any file name so that you know what is the most up-to-date version and then what is the final version. In your document where you're putting all the information about the project, the objective, study design, document how the data were generated. If you collected the data, how did you do it? If it comes from somewhere else, where does it come from? And either there or in your code, how was the data processed? If you're using code to process the data, put little lines of text as to what you're doing. Otherwise, find some other way to document how you process, how you actually change the data from the way it was originally to what you're working with at the end. One thing that's going to be very important for all of you is to keep a code book that describes exactly what each variable is. Again, for me, it's amazing to me how quickly I forget exactly how I created each variable. Makes life much easier if it's documented. If you use any codes or abbreviations in your variable and file names, it's good to keep a record of those. On the above slide, I mean, some of you will find some of that more useful than others. To pick and choose, and if you have any questions or trying to figure out how to do it, talk to your advisor, of course. Those of you who are working with humans, those of you who are collecting information about people, otherwise known as human subjects, you may need to have IRB approval. IRB, Institutional Review Board, regulates research with human subjects. If any of this applies to you, so there may be anonymity and confidentiality requirements associated with that data. If this applies to you, talk to your advisor. And also Professor Jackie Klopp is creating a separate video about IRB requirements. When you're storing your data, when you're all done with it, consider putting it somewhere where other researchers can use it, such as Mendeley data. And again, I believe Jackie Klopp is creating a video about that. These are some resources, additional resources. DMP stands for Data Management Plan. This DMP tool is an open access free resource for creating a data management plan. It's most likely way more than any of you need, but they have some useful general guidance that you may look at if you want more information. The last point, this Inter-University Consortium for Political and Social Research might be useful for those of you who are doing social science research. So that's it for this video. If you have any questions, talk to your advisor, and good luck with your research projects.